Hello and welcome to another Mechanics podcast. This podcast is the first in a series about the microbiome. So you may have seen from a lot of my tweets, a lot of the things that I say, that the microbiome is something that I've become absolutely fascinated with recently. So over the last few years, it's become more and more a part of what I've done in terms of my own side of things, my own side of health, and various other things. And I decided that actually I'm going to try and work this into my long-term career plans because I feel like it's the element of medicine that I was always missing. Because I felt like with medicine, one of the reasons why I wanted to leave was that the disproportionate amount of money that was put towards and the way that we were intervening in health, really, without the thought process of the kind of prevention of health. But the problem is that a lot of prevention of health things that we're trying to do don't seem to really be working. The obesity crisis and various other things that we're looking at. I mean, it's described recently that the obesity epidemic now needs to be described as a pandemic because even developing countries are starting to struggle with it. And the strain it may put on our system may just end up being too much. And I feel like the microbiome seems to fit in this middle ground that could be the reason why certain things do and don't work, why certain people struggle with weight and that side of things, why certain people struggle with certain diets, but also why certain diets might work. I also became very interested in this because of a personal journey that I went through, and I'm going to detail elements of that journey myself as I go through this, because I think it's quite important to note when these problems can arise, why they might have actually happened, and try to work back, like I do with running injury and like we do with lots of things, try and work back where things actually came from. So I'll start off with a kind of brief introduction of my journey, and I'm going to essentially almost start at the end, because it's taken a long time to fully work out what might have actually happened. And at the end of the day, because of the inability to fully test a lot of these things, because of the fact that the NHS and GPs don't really support a lot of this stuff, because you talk to most GPs and most doctors about the microbiome and they won't have a clue, to be honest. They will have an idea about antibiotics and the fact that certain bacteria can cause problems, but they won't really have much knowledge because we were never taught about it in medical school and there is no ongoing teaching. But I swear that it will become huge because when we fully understand all the different implications of the microbiome. But when I started having issues a couple of years ago, the issues were around a slightly irritable tummy. I was getting a lot of issues with reflux and getting a lot of problems that had just come out of nowhere. One of the major things that I started to notice was that almost every morning I was getting up with a stuffy nose. And I've never suffered with hay fever, I've never suffered with any of these problems, but also it was middle of winter. And I just started to notice that I was getting it, and I thought I had a constant cold. I thought then I had a bit of sinusitis, and it kind of went on from that. I got prescribed the usual kind of steroid spray from the GP, which did very little. It reduced some of the inflammation initially, but actually then made things worse. We thought it might be something like a fungal infection or something along those lines. But even then, the huge amount of advice, or there wasn't a lot of advice about it. So I eventually got through to being seen by ear, nose and throat. And they had a look and they basically showed that there was significant inflammation in the back of my nose, which showed that the likely problem was something called laryngeal or kind of LPR. So basically laryngopharyngeal reflux disease, and that it was basically in the middle of the night, my sphincter at the top of my stomach would open slightly for whatever reason, letting a little flecks of acid up through that was irritating the back of my throat, back of my nose, and that was causing the stuffiness. I also then at the same time started to notice a bit of a lump in my throat, which all went with the same things. The long story short is it turned out that I may have possibly had a bit of a problem with the parasite, that I picked up some in open water in other countries. It might have been related to the fact that I got a few bouts of food poisoning around that time that caused slightly change in my gut bacteria, which meant that when you change your gut bacteria, sometimes the normal foods that you eat don't fully agree with you. They tend to produce a lot more gas and trapped wind than they normally would. And I was noticing this. So certain foods would make me feel very bloated. Now, what can then happen is that bloat overnight can actually push up and increase pressure that can open up that sphincter, allowing those little flecks of acid through. So it all made sense. The other thing that tends to relax that sphincter is dark chocolate, which is one of my favourite things. I was having a little bar of, or a little tiny piece of dark chocolate, should I say, later in the evening after dinner at about 8 o'clock. And I never thought that was a problem, but it turns out that can actually cause a problem with serotonin, or a release of serotonin that can actually open the sphincter hours later. So that could have been causing it as well. But actually, a lot of this can be traced back to when I went through the ketogenic diet. So I went to an extremely low carbohydrate diet for about 6 months. And there's good evidence that if you go through that, you will actually get rid of a lot of very beneficial species by taking away their normal food source. So their normal food source would be more kind of starches, resistant carbohydrates, and certain fibers. But also, there's an issue with the fact that maybe we're having the wrong kind of fibre, and I'm going to address that in the next kind of series of podcasts. But we're going to keep this one relatively broad, try and start off from the beginning. So, why the microbe? Why the microbiome? Why are these things important? Well, when essentially you are given birth to, you are colonised with your mother's microbiome, and unfortunately, we know that if you've had a C-section or any other intervention, it can reduce the kind of laying down of that microbiome. Now, the other thing that we're going through now is there's a lot of things in our world that have tracked almost essentially with the obesity crisis that are, I believe, contributing to the adverse effect on the microbiome. If you add everything up together, it starts to paint a picture that actually what could be really going on is we're actually damaging our microbiome so significantly that not only is that stopping us from digesting our food properly and actually the nutrients from our food, which is what the microbiome really help us with, but also things like the mucus layer in our gut that's controlled by a bacteria called Akkermansia. If their numbers dwindle, then actually we start letting certain molecules from the bad bacteria, the gram-negatives, the E. coli's, into our blood. These are called lipopolysaccharides. And there's some evidence starting to suggest that those lipopolysaccharides, those molecules, could be causing inflammation at fat tissue, which was stopping the release of certain hormones and then possibly leading to an excess gain in weight because we don't understand how heavy we are. So if you come across the hormone leptin that is released from this fat tissue, it's like a fuel gauge. And if that's not released properly, then that could be leading to that weight gain. So I'm going to be going on these in the series of these podcasts, really going into detail, but we'll start off with why that's important, because your bacteria are part of you. And what we could be doing is actually significantly damaging them with the way that we're living our lives now. So I'm going to list off a load of things that we believe may be contributing to that. So number one is a significant reduction in the right kind of fibre. Now, the problem is when I speak to people about fibre, when you ask people about fibre and ask them to think of what is fibre, what they think of, they often think of things like the kind of green leafy veg, maybe, or salads, and cellulose and celery and those kind of things. And unfortunately, a lot of those got the kind of fibre, what's called insoluble fibre. That's basically, we call it roughage. Now, that's not the kind of fibre we really need, because actually that might increase bulk of the stools, but it doesn't really feed the good bacteria. Some bacteria do like it, but actually the bacteria that really do, the animal-based bacteria, the bacteria we really want, they love something called soluble fibre, which is something called things like inulin, which is found in things like onions, garlic, and various other vegetables. They contain insoluble fibre too, but they have a big amount of this soluble fibre. The other thing is it's in things like potatoes and various other things. It's in lots of grains, and in these various other bits and pieces, they all contain soluble fibre, but also things like beta-glucans that you find in oats. The problem with that is that they don't really get fully released, or we don't believe they do, unless they are soaked overnight. So when I soak my oats, this is the protocol that I use to get the most out of those oats, get the most essentially out for my bacteria, but also get the most nutrients out of them as well, because oats contain a lot of phytic acid, which is a blocker agent, which is essentially can block our uptake of minerals, which is exactly the opposite of what we want to do. And what you need to do is the oats themselves don't contain much of the enzyme phytase that helps you break it down. So what you need to often do is you can add in a spoon of something called buckwheat flour. And buckwheat flour has a lot of phytase in it, which helps it, when it's soaked, to break down the phytic acid. So I soak my oats in goat's milk, because I believe that goat's milk, the type of protein in goat's milk, is better for us, particularly in larger doses, than the A1 type that's in regular milk. In goat's milk, with a bit of this buckwheat flour, with a little bit of yogurt as well. And the yogurt, proper live yogurt. And I sit that overnight, and in the morning I have the oats, or in the lunchtime or whatever, I have those oats, and they then provide me with a lot of that beta-glucan, which is the starch that the microbiome love. But it only really comes out when we soak the oats. That's why the oats go gloopy. It's that gloopiness that is a sign. If you have oats that have just been thrown straight in and they don't have that gloopiness, then there's a possibility that you won't get much of that beta-glucan out to be able, the bacteria can then feed on it. So we've taken away a lot of that normal starch, essentially, that we would normally need, the kind of beta-glucan type starch. And the other thing that we've been doing is we've been adding in things like the green leafy vegetables that, whilst are very good for us, so there's a lot of good thing about the green vegetables, a lot of them are covered in a lot of pesticides. And we know that certain pesticides are very damaging to the gut microbiome because they actually damage them directly. So that's another thing that we've added in, and actually having your fibre through salads and various green kind of salads and packaged salads and spinach could actually be doing you more harm than good when it comes to the microbiome. The other thing that we've been doing is, obviously, stress has gone up, and that we've shown that adversely affects the microbiome. We're not exercising quite as much as we were, or we're not moving as much as we were. And again, movement and exercise are shown to enhance the microbiome. We're also not essentially the other things that we've added into our diet, so things like the kind of rancid seed oils, particularly, so vegetable oils. Those things have been shown to be damaging to the microbiome that we want, or essentially the ones that we really like. So using those they tend to promote, or they kind of often promote the production or the growth of other bacteria such as the E. coli and various other bacteria. Again, it's very, very, we're not really sure about a lot of these things, but it seems to come out in studies, and particularly mice studies, because when we can implant almost the same microbiome in a mouse, we can get results that would represent what would happen in a human. Now, what happens on beyond that is often misinterpreted in mouse studies because we are a bit more complicated. But when it comes to the microbiome, actually, we can get some really good results that may indicate what is worth testing in humans. The other thing is things like the cleanliness and kind of disinfection. We are cleaning and disinfecting everything because we're scared about bad bacteria, but actually we're killing off all the good ones too. And actually we're better off to be slightly not quite as clean, not quite as disinfected, and we'd probably be better off. For instance, things like vegetables, maybe we should be eating organic vegetables that have been lightly cleaned, not fully disinfected, not covered in pesticides and these things. And also things like the lack of fermented foods. Almost every kind of indigenous or traditional diet includes a lot of fermented food. So you've got the Bulgarians and the Eastern Europeans that did a lot of yogurt fermenting. That's why you've got Lactobacillus bulgaris. So lots of yogurt fermenting. Kefir, which is very similar to yogurt, a kind of fermented drink made from grains. Or they're not grains like the grains we're thinking of. They're kind of kefir grains. They look like little a kind of rice pudding. We have things like kombucha from the Far East, from kimchi, which is a kind of fermented cabbage from the Far East. We've got sauerkraut from Germany. We've got lots of different fermented, almost all breads that are, sourdough breads, almost all breads that are consumed by indigenous populations have been fermented because they fermented them. Right? They didn't have yeast, so they had to get yeast, they had to allow the bread to ferment with its own live yeast from the kind of around in the environment, like a sourdough starter. And all these different things, and they are all part of those indigenous diets, but they're all very lacking in our current diet. So those are the kind of things that we're going to be thinking about. Those are the kind of things I'm going to be talking about over this series of articles, about why the microbiome is so important, why it might be important to things like weight, but also things like health, and then sports performance, and all these other different factors. So I hope you enjoy this series of articles. This is number 1, and we try and releasing these over the next kind of every few days if I can get the time, to try and break everything down. If there's any questions you've got on this, please ask them. If there's anything you need clarifying, please ask, so I can then address it in subsequent podcasts. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you find them enjoyable.